This is Cybersecurity for Everyone. I'm Dr. Charles Harry. Now, we've been talking about the various effects that threat actors can have when they're actually on target. And in this video, I want to specifically talk about what we call secondary effects. As you might recall, a threat actor has a potential impact on a system. They can create a variety of different effects. And in the last video, we discussed primary effects. And in this video, I want to specifically move and talk about secondary effects, specifically the impacts that those threat actors can have on organizational processes and the capability to that particular network. So secondary effects are all about the indirect impacts on the targeted organization. So a cyber event can create indirect impacts to that targeted organization that stem from those initial effects on the targeted devices themselves. And so they can come in a variety of different forms. Those indirect impacts can come in the form of revenue effects, where we stop the production of goods or the provision of services. Examples might be something like the ability to create a disruption to customer orders. We could do that through, let's say, a distributed denial of service attack on your website. Or we might be able to directly impact your manufacturing capability by engaging in what's known as a SCADA attack. We also might be able to talk a little bit about remediation costs. And these are really about the costs associated with response and remediation to the specific event, where devices need to be repaired or maybe even entirely replaced. Employees might need to possibly work overtime. Those are all additional costs that we have to absorb. There's also reputational costs, the loss of confidence in a company. And that could be that a share price to the company is actually specifically affected, or customer perceptions about the security of their data might actually change. So let's talk first about revenue costs. So revenue costs or revenue effects are really about stopping the production of goods or the provision of a specific service. And as we discussed before, that might include things like creating disruptions to customer orders, like a DDoS of your website, or a direct impact to your manufacturing capability. But let's use the example of airline flights. So it might be that in order for an aircraft to take off, there are a couple parts of the organization that all have to work in tandem in order for an airplane to take off. There could be an operational network at the terminal that allows the ticketing agent to scan your booking receipt and allow you on the aircraft. It could also include a series of different devices and databases and applications that allow the pilot to file a flight plan. And then finally, it might also include network devices that allow aircraft to talk to not just other aircraft, but also to the tower themselves. And that allows them to take off and fly with confidence. But remember that if all three of those work, then you're able to take off or land aircraft. Remember, though, that each one of those organizational processes is underpinned by some sort of set of interconnected devices. So in this case, we just have a bunch of notional network devices denoted by X1 through X18. And the numbers themselves don't really mean anything, but it's just to remind you that underneath each one of these human processes lie technology that is interlinked. And as long as all three of those networks function properly, then the aircraft can take off and land. But what happens if a cyber attack takes down two key devices in one of those networks? Well, in that case, you might have one of those operational networks function, but the others fail. The second one fails because the devices themselves don't work, but the third organizational process fails because it's reliant on the second one. And so you get this cascading effect that emerges. So devices support organizational processes, and the failure of the process leads to disruptions to the organization generally. And these could be tied to extremely large revenue losses. We've seen examples of these types of attacks occur over the last several years. The NotPetya attack that was a ransomware variant that was spread all around the world, caused billions of dollars worth of damage, primarily because it impacted the ability of organizations to produce products or deliver services. A second effect that we may want to think about is remediation. Now remember, remediation is really all about the direct cost for the response or remediation of devices and the time that it takes for employees to actually do the work. So we have remediation costs tied to potentially repairing or replacing specific devices, or for the labor costs tied to employee work. So organizations will face questions about the cost of directly responding to the event. What are the specific costs to repair and replace impacted devices? If you're only talking about a single device, that may only be a few $1,000s. But if you're talking about thousands of devices, that cost might be in the millions of dollars. What are the specific costs to labor when you have to respond to the event? Oftentimes, you're spending quite a bit of money on overtime in order to get those systems and those networks back up and operational. Finally, there might even be legal fines and judgments that the organization will have to pay. And all of these types of costs are wrapped up in what we would call remediation. And then finally, there's reputational costs. The loss of confidence in your company. And that can manifest itself either through your share price, where the company's stock is now being sold by a large number of investors, or even about customer perceptions about the security of their data or the integrity of their supply chains might start to change. So organizations face these broader consequences that are above and beyond just the direct revenue costs or the remediation costs. They might include things like, do investors sell the organization's stock? In the aftermath of the Equifax hack, the stock fell by over 20%. It was a very significant impact. Will customers have less faith in the ability of that organization to protect their data? Will partners seek new relationships as they believe you are not well protected from cyber events? These are additional costs that are not directly tied to the primary effects on the devices, but emerge because the human factors, the human parts of the organization are now impacted. So they're interrelated, but they are different. So we get different attacks that can generate different effects. The defacement of a website, for instance, might have relatively minor primary effects. Some content is modified, files are quickly restored in about 30 minutes, but customers can't order products for that period of time. There might be some secondary effects, so the inability of customers to actually put their orders in might create a small disruption to revenue. And there might be some customer concerns, about the safety and security of their data, and maybe they use a competitor. So there are revenue and reputational secondary effects. If we compare that to, let's say, a different type of attack where ransomware is deployed on an assembly line, the primary effects are quite large. Devices controlling the manufacturing line are made completely inoperable for 72 hours. And there's no manufacturing that's able to take place. The secondary effects, again, can also be quite large. You now have an inability to manufacture goods for 72 hours, and there's lost revenue associated with that deficiency. It's also going to take maybe a week to clean up and install all the new equipment, so the remediation costs are really quite significant. And the overall share price might plummet because you're down for 3 days. So in this case, we have two different cyber events. One's the defacement of a website, the other's ransomware on the assembly line, and there are differences in effects. So hacking generates initial primary effects, which then lead to these additional consequences. The hacker, who remember is motivated by some sort of goal, engages in the hacking process, which leads to actions on target. That action on target creates a cyber event. And that cyber event has primary effects, which can be both disruptive or exploitive. And those primary effects then lead to secondary effects. And they can manifest themselves in the form of revenue loss, remediation costs, or reputational damage. And some cyber events can be so large against very specific and critically important institutions that they can actually create larger impacts on society. So what are some of the takeaways? Well, first of all, cyber attacks generate effects on organizations, and they derive from these initial actions of the threat actor. Secondary effects can impact revenue, remediation, or even reputation. Understanding the interplay between the primary and secondary effects is key to differentiating severity of cyber events. Remember, not all cyber events are the same. In our next episode, we'll talk specifically about the impacts on larger society. I hope to see you next time.